Welcome back to Forest Tactical. Today we're going to talk about an important concept to understand when mastering the handgun, which is sight picture, and talk about the difference between sight picture and sight alignment. So starting it out, we'll talk about sight alignment. Simply put, for iron sights, getting your front and rear sight perfectly lined up, square in your window, not too high, not too low, perfectly centered up. For a red dot, it's putting the dot right in the middle of that window and keeping it really, really still. For red dot, it really doesn't matter whether it's in the middle of the window, but we'll just say that's your best sight alignment. Sight picture is the relationship between your sights and your target. So those two things don't have to be perfectly aligned in order to get your good hits. Your sight alignment could be slightly to the left or the dot in the corner or the optic, wherever it may be, and you could still get an acceptable hit on target. But it's going to change based on distance, movement, shoot or no shoot targets. All those things are going to be factors in it. The reason I bring this up is I see a lot of shooters, even experienced shooters, go from 3 yards and they feel like they have to get a perfect sight picture at 3 yards, dots perfectly level, even, not moving, or front and rear sight perfectly aligned at 3 yards before they break their shot. So what I was seeing was people coming up, taking 40 years, breaking their shot, and that's at like 3-5 yards. You need to be able to be comfortable in getting out and taking a less than ideal sight alignment because it's still a good sight picture. You don't need to punch out, get a perfect sight alignment, and then break your shot. Well, I should say you usually don't need to do that. We'll cover some exceptions to that later on in the video. So picture can be less than ideal and still get you the results that you want, and you need to learn how to live with that, how to not have the dot perfectly centered up in the glass every single time, and that's okay, or having your front sight be slightly misaligned, slightly high, slightly low, whatever you want to call it, and still be okay with that and know when you can break that shot off and when you shouldn't break that shot off, because there's going to be factors that make it to where you can't with a less than ideal sight alignment. So a good demonstration of this, one of my favorite movies, Collateral with Tom Cruise. Great movie. There's a scene in it that many of you have probably seen. The yo homie, is that my briefcase scene? I'm going to put it up right now and we'll talk a little bit about what he does and what his sight picture is. So let's look at the video.
Yo, homie. That my briefcase?
Is your briefcase? Yeah, it is. Why, you want it back?
What about your wallet?
What else you got for me? Huh?
So you'll notice that Tom is in a very compromised position. He's got a weapon drawn on him. He has to move fast, and he's about a yard away from this guy. He decides to square up and take shots from the hip to start. And his second target didn't have a weapon out already, so he took a little bit more time, squared up to the target, took care of business on the second target before he could become a threat. This is a good example of what acceptable sight picture may look like in a self-defense shooting. If someone's already a threat from 1 yard, you don't have time to sit there and square up perfectly to the target and get your perfect sight picture. You may only have time to go from the hip and start breaking shots off right there. Now, an important note, this is not some Rex Kwon Do type video telling you break the wrist, walk away, or hit the gun when a gun's in your face. I'm not about that. This is not a tactics training for today. I probably would tell you just straight up, don't hit the gun if someone's got a gun in your face, or don't try to grab it because you're probably going to get shot in the face. The point was the fact that he got really good hits and knew that he had to move fast because there was an active threat in front of him, and from 1 yard away this was an acceptable sight picture. And then when he had a little bit more time on his second target, this was his acceptable sight picture. Got really good hits both ways. Now this is a movie, but I think that the principle actually remains good. Now in this video I do use a red dot, but all my red dots do have co-witness iron sights for backups, and so you can see when I'm putting up an example of what things look like, where the iron sights are moving and where the dot's moving at the same time. So if you're an iron sight shooter, just pay attention to the iron sights. If you're a dot shooter, pay attention to where the dot is. I'm going to bring up a few examples where we'd bring the dot to the top of the window, sides of the window. Just replace that with having your iron sight to the far right, left, up, or down. It's the same concept for both red dot and for irons, just different in practice. So what is an acceptable hit? Let's talk about that. For me, it's an alpha zone, whether that's you're using IDPA or a USPSA target. The alpha zones are always squared up right center of the target. They're always going to be center mass, where you're going to be aiming if you ever had to use your gun in self-defense or in competition because you want to get those alpha hits. You don't want to drop points. Whatever way you want to look at it, the alpha zone is just a good practice. Now you can make that smaller, you can make it bigger based on your intended use, but just using an alpha zone I think is important, and that's what I'm going to call my acceptable hits today. So with my less than ideal sight picture and sight alignment on some of these, can I get a really good alpha hit predictably? And if I can get a predictable alpha hit and do it fast and maybe with a less than ideal sight picture, that's what I'm looking for. So acceptable sight picture matters different at different distances. Theoretically, at 1 yard, we should be able to literally just go from the hip, and just looking over our gun and seeing that we're square should be a good enough sight picture to get alphas. Let's test it out. Without putting any effort at all, besides squaring up to the target and just shooting from the hip, I was able to get perfectly acceptable hits. 3 yards, I feel a little bit less comfortable going from the hip, just because it's a little bit further out and there's a lot of movement that can happen here. But if I come both hands to the target and square up like this, will I get a good hit? As you can see, there's a little bit of variance. As we had one drop, it was my first one, dropped a little low. I was able to kind of readjust and bring it back in. Just shows you it's not a perfect sight picture, but overlooking the whole gun and just staring at the target squared up without even seeing my dot at all, I'm able to put perfect hits in the target. Now at 7 yards, the rules kind of change. I can't get predictable alpha zone hits by going from here or from the hip. I need to see my dot. But where does my dot need to be in the window to get those hits? Let's practice putting the dot maybe at the top and the sides and the bottom of the window and see if I can still get alpha zone hits, even though I'm not perfectly lined up right in the middle of my optic. I'm going to put the dot at the very top of my optic, then I'm going to put it all the way to the right, then bottom, then the left, and see where we're hitting on the target. Okay, so starting out, center of the target. Now I'm going to move it all the way to the right of the window, all the way to the left of the window, all the way to the top, and all the way to the bottom. So pretty equal spacing. We got one right in the middle, one to the right of the alpha zone still in, one to the left barely out. The one on the top still clearly in, the one on the bottom is a line break. So this shows you that generally you don't have to have it lined up right in the middle, but if you are going to the very opposite ends, you might hit outside of the alpha. If you're going up, you're probably still going to be good. Moving down, probably still going to be good. But the left and right, if you go all the way to the edge of the glass, you're probably going to be out. So if you're barely starting to see your dot on the draw and you fire the round right as it comes into the window, you might not get an alpha hit. You'll still get a Charlie hit, still be plenty acceptable. It's just a matter of where you want to hit on the target. So for me, there's a little bit of play from 7 yards. If it's not perfectly lined up, that's okay. I'm probably still going to get that alpha hit. And I know as long as my dot isn't on the very far end of my optic window, then I'm going to be just fine. When it went off the target on the alpha, I was literally all the way to the edge of the window. But something to be aware of, if you're on the very far left of your window or far right of your window, you could technically hit outside of alpha. We are back at about 25 yards away, and I can already tell you that when I was doing the tests on where the dot's going to be inside the window at the far left and right, you're off the target at 25 yards. So not much of a point in shooting that at the very extreme ends of the optic. You know you have to have it pretty dang centered in order to get a good hit. But I'm just going to come off ever so slightly and kind of show the deviation there. Aiming dead center, if I come up and put the dot almost to the very top of the window, you're basically hitting a headshot, barely moving it right. I was hitting right here on the side of the target, barely going low. I was all the way at the bottom of the target, and then going left, I was all the way off the target. So we don't even have to take the dot all the way to the right as far as it can go, or all the way to the left, before it starts landing off the target or so far up, down, right, left, that you're not even getting close to the A zone. So at 25 yards, you want to make sure that that dot is nice and centered in your optic, and you want to make sure that there's no movement at all left to right or up and down. And that's super important that you get a really good grip so that you're not jerking it left, right, or down or up before you break that shot as well, or else you might not even be hitting the target. So it's critical that we acknowledge that distance isn't the only determining factor in what our acceptable sight picture is. Because if we see something like this, a no shoot in front of our intended target, we can't shoot from the hip and we can't shoot from the low ready At that point, we're going to be sending rounds where we don't want them. So at 1 yard away or at 3 yards away, I'm going to want to make sure I have a pretty good sight picture with my dot, evenly squared up within my window so that I can make that shot. It's also super important that you know your offset, which we talked about in our zero video before, because if you're from 1 yard or 3 yards out, there's going to be an offset for where you're aiming and where point of impact is going to hit. Now it's going to be very minimal, but if you have a window this small, minimal matters. So at 3 yards out, this is a little bit more of what I would try to do to get a good sight picture. Instead of being here, I'm going to be up here, factoring in my offsets, making a really good hit. And that is what I'd call an acceptable sight picture at 3 yards at that point. It's not just the distance that matters. We also want to consider what's going on around us. We want to consider cover, concealment. We want to consider movement, because all those things are going to determine your acceptable sight picture as well. So an important thing to note is all this is dependent on whether or not you can get square to the target. There's so many factors that will determine what your acceptable sight picture is, because you might have a situation where you might not be able to see your sights right away like we talked about. But if you're not square to your target and you're shooting from the compressed ready and you're off to the side or you're bladed this way, you're not going to get those good hits. So understand that that only works when you are square to the target. And as your skill grows, your understanding of acceptable sight picture will change in time. You'll be able to do things at a faster pace. You'll be able to do things without having a perfect alignment that you didn't think you were able to do before. But circumstances are going to dictate that. So why does this matter? This matters because in a self-defense situation, your life is on the line and you don't have the time to spare to get a perfect sight picture all the time. There's also going to be times where your life or someone else's life may be on the line and you have to get that perfect sight picture as soon as you possibly can. And you need to know the difference of when you can use one or the other. And you need to train both. Train no shoots, train movement, train everything that you can to understand acceptable sight picture better. And it really will transition to self-defense. It also transitions to competition because you want to get good alpha zone hits in the least amount of time as possible. So this applies to everybody in the shooting world. No matter what level you're on, you're going to want to understand this and understand what you're capable of. So go out there, test it out, see how fast you can shoot accurately, push yourself to the edge to really find out where your failure point is, because then you're going to get better, you're going to have a better understanding, you're going to be able to better protect yourself or be better in competition. So as usual, comment below. I get a lot out of those comments. It's great discussion that we've had in our last few videos. And don't forget to like and subscribe if you want similar content in the future. Thanks.